At the dawn of the automobile age, America was flooded with hopeful startups. Dozens of names promised to put the nation on wheels, but most burned out as quickly as they appeared. Into that chaos rolled Studebaker, a wagon maker from Indiana with a reputation for toughness and a habit of doing things differently. They weren't based in Detroit, they didn't follow the industry playbook, and their cars rarely matched the fashion cycle. Sometimes they were years ahead, sometimes hopelessly behind, but they were never boring. What followed was a story of odd choices, bold risks, and unforgettable surprises. From wagons to wheels, Studebaker's roots go back to 1852, long before cars existed. Two brothers opened a blacksmith shop in South Bend and started building wagons for pioneers heading west. These weren't just tools, they were lifelines that carried families and supplies across brutal trails. By the Civil War, the U.S. Army was relying on Studebaker wagons to move men and materiel. Soldiers joked you could spot them because they were still rolling when every other wagon was broken down on the roadside. That reputation for toughness stuck, and when the horseless carriage era finally arrived, Studebaker had something no startup could fake: trust. Electric before Tesla. By 1902, Studebaker was already selling electric cars. They weren't science projects. They were full-fledged horseless carriages with big wooden wheels, tiller steering, and a silent glide that felt futuristic compared to rattling gasoline engines. Wealthy city buyers loved them for short trips across town, but the batteries were weak. 20 miles of range was about all you could squeeze out, and charging was slow and inconvenient. Out on America's open roads, electrics just couldn't compete. By 1911, Studebaker admitted defeat and shifted to gasoline. A century later, Tesla would be hailed as a pioneer, but Studebaker had tried it first. Borrowed engines. When Studebaker finally went all in on gasoline, they didn't build their own engines right away. Instead, they borrowed them from suppliers like Garford. It was a shortcut that let them focus on what they already did best: sturdy frames and dependable bodies. Buyers didn't care whose cylinders were under the hood as long as the car was reliable. In an era when dozens of automakers were vanishing every year, outsourcing was survival. Eventually, Studebaker would develop its own engines, but in those early years, it was about staying in the game. They weren't innovators yet, just survivors with good instincts. Out of Detroit's Shadow Ford, GM, and Chrysler all set up shop in Detroit. Studebaker stayed in South Bend, Indiana. That distance made them different. South Bend was smaller, more personal, and the company became a source of local pride. Everyone knew someone who worked the line, and the cars carried the spirit of a hometown product. But being outside Detroit also had a downside. Studebaker didn't have the same network of suppliers, engineers, and allies. They were an outsider, free to experiment, but cut off from the lifeline of the industry. Independence made them inventive, but it also made them vulnerable. Civil War to World War, Studebaker's military legacy stretched far beyond wagons. By World War I, they were building trucks and ambulances for the U.S. Army. When World War II arrived, their production ramped up again, this time delivering command cars, US-6 6x6 trucks, and license-built Wright R 1820 aircraft engines for B-17. It was a rugged six-wheel drive beast, built in South Bend but shipped worldwide. Thousands went to the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program, where soldiers nicknamed them Studers. On the Eastern Front, they became legends. Ford and GM usually get the glory, but Studebaker was quietly just as vital. The bullet nose gamble. In 1950-51, Studebaker shocked America with cars that looked like jet planes without wings. The so-called bullet nose design stuck a giant chrome spinner right in the middle of the grille. Some buyers thought it was futuristic and daring, others thought it looked like a rolling rocket booster. It was risky, but it worked. The design gave Studebaker one of its best sales years ever. In an era obsessed with aviation and space-age dreams, the bullet nose cars fit the mood perfectly. They weren't beautiful in the traditional sense, but they were unforgettable, and that was exactly the point. The fishbowl coupe. The Starlight Coupe, introduced in 1947, turned heads for one strange reason: its wraparound rear glass. The design made the back half of the car look like a fishbowl, with passengers surrounded by curved panes instead of solid sheet metal. No other American car looked like it. Some buyers loved the panoramic views, others complained about the greenhouse heat. Either way, it gave Studebaker an identity as a company willing to try what Detroit wouldn't. While the big three stuck to safer shapes, Studebaker doubled down on eccentric design and briefly set the standard for originality. The champion of compacts. In 1939, when Americans were buying huge, chrome-heavy cars, Studebaker went the opposite direction. They introduced the Champion, a compact and affordable car that prioritized fuel economy and simplicity. At the time, it looked like madness. Who wanted smaller cars when gas was cheap? But the gamble worked. The Champion kept Studebaker alive during the lean years of the Great Depression and made it a favorite with budget-conscious buyers. Long before Detroit ever thought about economy cars, Studebaker proved there was a market. They weren't just chasing trends, they were inventing them. The Scotsman stripped bare. By the late 1950s, Studebaker doubled down on minimalism with the Scotsman, a car so bare bones it made competitors look extravagant. Launched for 1957 to 58, it came with no chrome trim, no armrests, and even painted bumpers instead of shiny ones. The message was clear. This was a car for frugality above all, and it worked, especially with fleet buyers and thrifty families. The Scotsman sold surprisingly well in a market drowning in tail fins. Once again, Studebaker proved they could win by being different, even if that difference was selling a car that looked like it came straight out of a budget catalog. The Golden Hawk's secret muscle. In 1956, Studebaker unleashed the Golden Hawk, a luxury coupe that looked refined but hid a monster under the hood. That first year it used Packard's 352 V8. In 1957 to 58, Studebaker switched to its own 289 and added a Paxton supercharger, giving it serious horsepower that could outrun many V8 muscle machines of its era. Buyers didn't expect speed from a Studebaker, but that was exactly why it shocked people. It wasn't just a family car, it was a drag strip sleeper in disguise. The Golden Hawk made Studebaker a rare mix of elegant and brutal, proving that even a small-town automaker could humble Detroit's big guns when it wanted to. The Avanti's futuristic gamble. In 1962, Studebaker unveiled the Avanti, a fiberglass-bodied coupe that looked like nothing else on the road. Designed by Raymond Loewy's team in record time, it had a shark nose front, smooth curves, and no grille at all, radical for the era. Some loved it, others were baffled, but nobody could ignore it. The Avanti wasn't just about looks. With optional Paxton superchargers, factory-prepared Avantis set 29 speed records at Bonneville, including runs around 170 miles per hour, and Studebaker billed it as the fastest American production car of its day. The only problem? By then, the company itself was already on life support. Disc brakes. Before Detroit, Studebaker quietly introduced standard front disc brakes on the 1963 Avanti, years before Detroit's giants dared to. It was a European-style upgrade that gave the car serious stopping power. At a time when most American cars relied on drum brakes that faded under pressure, the Avanti's discs were a revelation. The move showed Studebaker's willingness to borrow the best ideas from abroad and apply them at home. Unfortunately, advanced brakes didn't matter much when the company behind them was collapsing. The tech was brilliant, but it became another example of Studebaker innovating just a little too late. Supercharged sleepers. Studebaker had been dabbling with superchargers since the 1950s, but in the Avanti and Lark R series, they made it official. Instead of building bigger engines, Studebaker bolted on Paxton superchargers and gave their modest V8s new life. It was clever, efficient, and decades ahead of the turbocharged movement. The result was family cars that could suddenly embarrass muscle machines. At Bonneville, supercharged Studebakers broke records nobody expected. While Detroit bragged about displacement, Studebaker showed how brains could beat brawn. In the end, though, the marketing muscle of the big three drowned them out. Adjustable compression tricks. Here's one of Studebaker's strangest engineering quirks. Their 259/289 V8s used different piston crowns and heads to deliver different compression ratios from the factory. That meant the same basic engine could sip cheap, low-octane fuel or, with the right spec, handle premium gas for more performance. It was a mechanic's dream, offering flexibility that few automakers even considered. But the feature was never promoted heavily, so most buyers didn't realize their Studebaker could be ordered or built for more power. Like so many of the company's best ideas, it was clever engineering hidden in plain sight. Gear-driven whine. Unlike most engines that used timing chains, Studebaker's early V8s relied on gears to drive their camshafts. On paper, it was brilliant. Gears didn't stretch or slip, so timing stayed precise. In practice, it created a loud mechanical whine that drivers either found charming or annoying. That sound became part of the car's personality, a mechanical quirk that separated Studebakers from Detroit rivals. To some, it was efficiency. To others, it was noise. But either way, it made the cars memorable. Studebaker engines didn't purr quietly. They announced themselves with a gear-driven growl. Tiny valves, big problems. Studebaker's early V8s had one odd flaw. Their intake and exhaust valves were unusually small compared to rivals. That gave the engines quick throttle response at low speeds, but at higher revs, the motor struggled to breathe. Drivers described it like trying to run a marathon while sipping air through a straw. No matter how much tuning or carburetor swapping you did, the valve size was a built-in limitation. The cars felt lively off the line, but ran out of steam on the highway. It was a permanent bottleneck that kept Studebaker engines from competing with bigger Detroit V8s. Full-skirt pistons. While most automakers moved to lighter slipper pistons in the 1950s, Studebaker stubbornly stuck with full-skirt pistons. They were tough and durable, which fit the company's reputation for ruggedness. But they were also heavy, creating extra friction and slowing throttle response. For performance cars like the Golden Hawk or Avanti, the heavy pistons were less of an issue. But in everyday sedans, they added to Studebaker's image of being old-fashioned and inefficient. It was one of those engineering choices that made sense for longevity but worked against speed and economy. Economy-first philosophy. Unlike Detroit's obsession with horsepower, Studebaker engineers often focused on fuel efficiency. Their design notes repeatedly emphasized economy rather than raw power. This meant their cars were more practical for families who wanted range and reliability, but less exciting on the drag strip. That philosophy made sense in hard economic times, but it clashed with the American appetite for flash and performance. While Ford and Chevy were boasting about cubic inches, Studebaker quietly built engines that could sip fuel more carefully. It was smart, but in the muscle car era, it was a hard sell. Oil drain. Woe's Studebaker V8s also had a reputation among some owners for odd oiling behavior. Reports from high-mile engines mentioned top-end oiling pressure quirks, with valve covers holding more oil than ideal and the bottom end not always getting what it needed. Owners who changed oil regularly still sometimes found engines wearing out prematurely. Mechanics debated causes for years. It became one of those reliability quirks that fed the company's reputation. Studebaker engines were tough in many ways, but this perceived flaw proved maddening. Land speed surprise. Despite these quirks, Studebaker engines found unexpected success at the Bonneville salt flats. Their overbuilt designs, originally meant for reliability, could handle serious stress. With tuning and superchargers, they set land speed records in cars like the Avanti. In the early 1960s, Studebaker shocked everyone by producing a fiberglass-bodied Avanti that hit 170 miles per hour. At the time, it was the fastest production car in America, and it shattered 29 records. For a small company from Indiana to outrun Ferraris on the salt was nothing short of astonishing. Andy Granatelli's Studebakers. Few names in racing were as colorful as Andy Granatelli, and in the early 1960s, he turned Studebakers into salt flat legends. Granatelli pushed Avantis and Larks to their limits at Bonneville, where the thin air and endless straights revealed just how strong Studebaker engines really were. With superchargers and tuning, these cars went faster than anyone expected. The irony was that Studebaker never built them for racing. They were supposed to be reliable family cars, but Granatelli showed that when stressed to the extreme, Studebakers could go toe-to-toe with the best. The perfect math engine, one of Studebaker's proudest achievements, was the R2 supercharged V8. It had 289 cubic inches of displacement and produced exactly 289 horsepower. That was 1 horsepower per cubic inch, the gold standard of the era. At a time when Detroit was chasing bragging rights with bigger and bigger blocks, Studebaker managed to squeeze that kind of performance out of a compact engine. It proved that careful engineering and forced induction could match raw size. For a small company to hit that magic number was both deliberate and defiant. The R3 and R4 experiments. Owning Paxton superchargers gave Studebaker room to experiment. Engineers developed wilder versions of their engines, dubbed R3 and R4. These motors pushed horsepower well beyond what most buyers ever saw on the street. A handful of prototypes even tested twin superchargers and outrageous carburetor setups. Unfortunately, production was limited and the company was running out of money. Most of these hot rod engines lived only in catalogs or experimental cars. Still, they showed Studebaker's willingness to push boundaries when the industry least expected it. They were too rare to save the brand, but unforgettable to enthusiasts. Racing on a budget Studebakers were never marketed as race cars, but their toughness made them favorites among grassroots racers. Stock car drivers and drag racers discovered the engines could take punishment lap after lap. They weren't glamorous, but they were reliable and affordable. Some racers even turned humble larks into track terrors by bolting on superchargers and tuning the gear ratios. Studebaker never intended to be a performance brand, but by the 1960s, it had earned a quiet reputation in racing circles. Winning on Sunday might sell on Monday, but for Studebaker, it mostly sold respect. Dealers couldn't sell them. For all their racing surprises and engineering quirks, Studebaker dealers often struggled to explain the cars to average buyers. Why was the styling so different? Why was there no chrome on one model? Why did the engines whine? Salesmen in the 1950s and 60s had an easier time pushing Chevys or Fords that fit expectations. Studebaker asked customers to embrace weirdness, and not everyone did. While enthusiasts loved the individuality, the mainstream market hesitated. The very quirks that made Studebaker stand out in history made it hard to move cars off the lot. The Packard merger mess. In 1954, Studebaker merged with Packard, another struggling automaker. On paper, it looked like a smart alliance, combining resources to fight the big three. In reality, it was a disaster. Packard's finances were worse than expected, and Studebaker's losses dragged both companies down. The two brands never integrated smoothly. Packard buyers looked down on Studebaker, and Studebaker fans didn't want rebadged Packards. Instead of creating strength, the merger created confusion. By the late 1950s, both names were tainted, and what could have been a lifeline turned into a shared funeral march. Management in turmoil. Studebaker's leadership changed hands often, and stability was rare. Some presidents focused on innovation, others on desperate cost-cutting. Harold Vance, one of the company's key figures, was nicknamed the Undertaker for his ability to close deals and close factories. That constant churn at the top meant no clear, long-term vision. While Ford and GM plotted decades ahead, Studebaker lurched from one short-term fix to another. Every few years, the strategy changed, and with it, the company's identity. It was a recipe for instability that eroded trust inside and outside the company. Dealers on the edge. As losses mounted, Studebaker dealers bore the brunt of the chaos. They were stuck trying to sell quirky cars against Ford's endless marketing machine and Chevrolet's massive dealer network. Many dealers closed and others switched to competing brands. The shrinking sales force only accelerated the decline. Without a wide distribution network, even good cars like the Avanti struggled to reach buyers. Loyal Studebaker dealers fought to the end, but for many it was a slow bleed that ended in bankruptcy. The network that once gave South Bend pride became a liability. Selling stock, not cars. By the 1960s, Studebaker's business model had turned upside down. Instead of making profits from cars, they increasingly relied on financial operations and stock maneuvering. The cars were almost secondary. Investors noticed and customers sensed it. A car company that focused more on Wall Street than Main Street was never going to inspire loyalty. While Ford and GM poured billions into new models, Studebaker was trying to stay alive with accounting tricks. The result was predictable: shrinking relevance on the showroom floor. The Canadian lifeline. When U.S. production ended in 1963, Studebaker wasn't completely dead. Their Canadian plant in Hamilton kept the brand alive for 2 more years. Cars rolled out until 1966, but there was a catch. These final Studebakers didn't even use Studebaker engines. They borrowed Chevrolet 6s and V8s, turning the last models into hybrids of South Bend styling and Detroit hardware. Dealers joked about Chevy Bakers. For a company once proud of independence, it was a heartbreaking ending. The name lived on, but the soul of Studebaker was gone. Workers heard it on the radio. When Studebaker shut down its South Bend factory on December 9, 1963, the moment was as brutal as it was sudden. Employees who had shown up for their morning shifts heard the news ripple through the plants and across local airwaves almost at once. The last South Bend car followed later that month. For South Bend, it was devastating. Generations had worked the line, and whole families had counted on steady wages from Studebaker. Losing the plant didn't just mean lost jobs, it stripped away the identity of an entire city. The shockwaves lingered for decades. South Bend kept the keys. The factory went quiet, but the town didn't let the story end. Former workers, collectors, and locals gathered the drawings, badges, and old test mules and built a home for them. On any given weekend, you could see a bullet nose parked next to an Avanti salt flat car and a wagon that once crossed the prairie. The pride shifted from assembly lines to memory. School trips, car clubs, and families walked past the machines that put food on their tables. Studebaker stopped building cars, but South Bend kept the keys and made sure the lights stayed on for anyone who wanted to remember. Soviet soldiers loved them. Studebaker's wartime trucks didn't just serve American GIs, they became legends in the Soviet Union. Through the Lend-Lease program, thousands of U.S. six-wheel drive trucks rolled across the Atlantic and into Red Army service. Russian soldiers adored them, calling them Studders. They were rugged, easy to repair, and capable of hauling supplies across the worst terrain. So respected were these trucks that Soviet engineers later copied parts of their design for their own vehicles. To this day, old photos of the Eastern Front often show Studebakers alongside T-34 tanks. In a strange twist, the small Indiana company earned as much respect from Soviet troops as from American ones. That kind of cross-cultural credibility was unmatched. Hollywood came calling. Studebaker's quirks made them irresistible to Hollywood. The bullet-nosed cars of the early 1950s, with their jet-age spinners, showed up in countless films and TV shows whenever directors wanted something instantly distinctive. Later, the sleek Avanti became a natural choice for stylish characters in dramas and thrillers. Studebakers never reached Mustang or Corvette levels of fame on screen, but they had a reputation as the oddball's car. Directors liked them because the audience always noticed. You could not mistake a bullet-nosed Studebaker for anything else, and that visual punch translated well to film. Even as sales dwindled, the company's eccentric designs found an afterlife in American pop culture. The Avanti wouldn't die. The Avanti was meant to save Studebaker, but in an odd twist, it ended up outliving the company itself. When Studebaker folded in 1966, a group of investors bought the rights and tooling for the Avanti and restarted production under the name Avanti II. Built in tiny batches, these cars were often hand-assembled and customized to order. Ownership of the Avanti brand changed hands several times, yet the model somehow staggered forward into the 1980s and even the 1990s. That meant a single Studebaker design outlived its parent company by 3 decades. The Avanti proved that bold, forward-thinking design could have staying power long after the corporate logo had vanished. Cult following after death. When Studebaker finally closed its doors, it seemed like the story was over. But among car enthusiasts, the brand never died. Collectors and hot rodders clung to Larks, Hawks, and especially the Avanti. keeping the name alive at shows and in garages. Even today, Studebaker clubs exist worldwide, sharing parts, stories, and restoration tips. What makes the following unique is not just nostalgia, but respect for the company's originality. Unlike cookie-cutter Detroit iron, Studebakers stood out. They were quirky and sometimes flawed, but always interesting. That individuality gave them a cult appeal that outlasted their market share. Studebaker failed in business, but it triumphed in memory. Influence on Detroit. Though Studebaker faded, its fingerprints lingered on American car design. Their early push into compact cars influenced Detroit to consider smaller vehicles long before the gas crisis of the 1970s. Their use of disc brakes, superchargers, and fiberglass helped normalize technologies that the Big Three eventually adopted. Even when Detroit laughed at their strange styling, it was often Studebaker that got there first. The Avanti's smooth, grille-less nose foreshadowed designs that would become mainstream decades later. The idea of getting European-style performance out of American cars also carried forward. Studebaker may have vanished, but Detroit quietly absorbed its lessons. A brand without borders. Studebaker's story was not confined to the United States. Their cars sold in Canada, Latin America, and even parts of Europe. In Australia, they were known for toughness on rough roads. In the Soviet Union, their wartime trucks became legendary. That global reach was remarkable for a company much smaller than Ford or GM. Today, Studebaker is remembered differently depending on where you go. In Russia, it is the trucks. In America, it is the Avanti. In South Bend, it is the memory of a factory town that once supplied the world. For such a small company, Studebaker's shadow stretched surprisingly far. The last Chevy Bakers. By the mid-1960s, Studebaker was hanging on by a thread. Their final cars, built in Canada, carried Chevrolet engines under the hood. Purists saw this as the ultimate indignity. A company once proud of independence had resorted to using competitor hardware. Dealers jokingly called them Chevy Bakers. Yet these last models still sold to loyal customers who simply wanted the Studebaker badge. They may not have been true Studebakers in spirit, but they represented one last stubborn stand before the brand finally disappeared in 1966. For collectors today, those final cars are bittersweet reminders of how far the company had fallen. The legacy of weirdness. Studebaker was never the strongest, never the richest, and never the safest bet, but it was consistently the weirdest, and that is why it remains unforgettable. From wagons that carried pioneers west, to electric cars a century ahead of their time, to fiberglass coupes that outran Ferraris, Studebaker always did things differently. The legacy is not in mass production or profits, but in daring. Studebaker proved that small companies could punch above their weight, shock the giants, and create designs that people still talk about generations later. Their cars were odd, brave, and sometimes doomed, but never boring. That is why Studebaker still matters. Studebaker was supposed to be just another casualty of the early auto industry, a wagon maker swallowed up by Detroit's giants. Instead, it became a legend. The company zigged when others zagged, built cars that looked like spaceships or fish bowls, and sometimes even outran the world's fastest machines. They failed in business, but they succeeded in carving out a place in history. Like the DeLorean decades later, Studebaker proved that being different can be both fatal and unforgettable. Today, every quirky design and every surviving Avanti tells the same story. The weird kid in class left a mark that the big bullies never could.